We are about to begin a lecture, or I would rather say a brief introduction about Ukrainian culture. And this is quite a challenge, because what we're going to speak about is several thousands of years of culture, and a very diverse culture involving different ethnic and different religious and other types of backgrounds. And as I was asked to make it a very brief introduction, less than an hour, I tried to pick up several cases or several objects that are important and meaningful for certain periods, and my story will be around those objects or cases or examples of culture. A few words to introduce myself. My name is Tetyana Filevska. I'm a curator, an art historian, and a cultural manager from Kyiv. At the moment, I work at the institution which is called Ukrainian Institute, and I'm a creative director and a deputy of the general director there. Ukrainian Institute was established just a few years ago in order to bridge Ukraine's culture with other cultures around the world. And we were organized as counterparts for such, let's say, experienced institutions as the British Council or the Goethe Institute. So our mission can be compared to those by these institutions. So Ukrainian Institute works in all different kinds of arts and all different medium, and we do projects of cooperation between Ukraine and other countries, and we also do different projects in order to inform about Ukraine, its culture. So, for example, we have online courses about Ukraine, its culture and identity. We produce sometimes books, sometimes video materials, short videos, short films, or larger versions. We, of course, help to organize Ukraine's programs on various festivals or bigger institutions like exhibitions or film programs, and many other types of cultural interventions. You're most welcome to visit our website, ui.org.ua, and find hundreds of projects that we were able to complete so far. At the moment, because of the brutal Russian invasion, our team is spread everywhere around Europe. Some people still stay in Ukraine. Some are abroad with their families, like me, for example, because I had to flee the country with my little kids, and I'm currently based in London, the UK. Of course, thanks to the pandemic, we're able to work on distance now. So we continue our work basically from the first hours of invasion, helping to communicate the truth about what is happening and the war, and to explain actually the true reasons of this neo-colonial war of Russia against the sovereign state of Ukraine. So let me begin. And first of all, here we are. That's Ukraine, a huge country in the heart of Europe that borders with 6 other countries, of which most are part of the EU at the moment. And on one side, or actually on 2 borders, we have Russia and Belarus. And we have also access to the Black Sea on the south of Ukraine. 2022, third millennium, and we are facing a brutal invasion of Russia against Ukraine, which actually makes Ukraine visible to the world, which is also an outstanding and a very important issue, because so far Ukraine, being one of the largest in Europe and having a rich history and culture, was basically invisible to most of the world. And based on the research we have completed, the world has almost very little knowledge about Ukraine. And unfortunately, before the 24th of February, this knowledge was limited to a number of notions, and they were mostly negative associations with Ukraine. And hardly any cultural associations, hardly any cultural notions were familiar to the world. One thing that the world definitely knows about Ukraine is that we have had 3 revolutions in 30 years. And we basically were, we as the people of Ukraine, I mean, we won in these revolutions, having those values that we were standing for, the democratic values, win in Ukraine, and actually this make our choice, the European choice of Ukraine, obvious to the rest of the world. But instead, deeper on the side of these political topics, the news headlines, we hardly have, we have, as I already told, we have hardly any deeper understanding of what is Ukrainian culture and where to find it. So now we will have an overview and an excursion into Ukraine's history and history of culture. So usually when we talk about culture, we talk about culture of all the people, of all the nations that inhabited our land. And we know from history that the first inhabitants or the first culture that was found on the territory of Ukraine was so-called Tripilla culture. Tripilla is the name of a village nearby Kyiv where a lot of pottery was found. And so Tripilla is defined as the quite a prominent, quite a developed culture that has a meaningful and quite important role of pottery in their everyday life, in their culture. You can see on this image a number of objects, both of everyday use, of ritual meaning, toys even, made out of clay and designed in a very sophisticated manner. These people of Tripilla, they also lived in basically clay houses. And these houses had sometimes several floors, so they were not like very premature. They were already quite complicated and sophisticated buildings. And they also had wheels already, so they were acquainted with this civilization know-how of its time. And Tripilla is dated at least 3,000 years BC. So it's one of these ancient cultures of its time, and several settlements of this culture were found around different places of Ukraine. And we have plenty of the objects of this culture in different museums in Ukraine. So this is the, let's say, prehistoric part of our culture. Another example of this ancient history, ancient culture that we have on our territory is this stone sculpture, which is called Kurgan Stela or Bovani, Bolbons. So these are figures of ancient goddess who were considered to be the ancient ancestors of the tribe, of the family. And they were situated around the settlements, around the villages, to protect the inhabitants of the village from the enemies. These statues, these stone figures, are found all around central Ukraine, central and southern Ukraine, and eastern as well. And many of them were also collected in at different times and are in different museums. For example, I was very surprised to see one of them in Oxford in museum when I visited recently. So these are also quite a famous examples of ancient historic culture of Ukraine. Another nation that lived on the territory of Ukraine before the Slavs came were the Scythians. Scythians were nomadic tribes that inhabited largest part of Ukraine, and they were not only nomadic warriors, but they were also sophisticated jewelry makers. And you can see this on the example of pectoral. Basically the masterpiece, one of the most prominent and amazing pieces of ancient golden jewelry work, which was very well preserved and is kept in Ukraine now in one of the major museums. This pectoral probably belonged to a very noble person in the Scythian tribe, and it has several layers with this animalistic and floral designs, very sophisticated, very well done, and well preserved, as I said. And pectoral is one of these masterpieces of ancient history. So Scythians lived in the middle of first millennium before Christ, BC, and also had a very large archaeological and cultural heritage to further generations and further cultures in Ukraine. Among the ancient, let's say, cultures that inhabited some parts of Ukraine is also ancient Greek culture. Along the coast of the Black Sea, there were several Greek cities, Greek colonies, basically. One of the most prominent and most famous one is Chersonis in Sebastopol, in the Bay of Sebastopol, which was also a big center for trade. And also you can see on this image that we have a lot of these remains of this ancient city, which is not only famous as the ancient Greek city in Ukraine, but also is famous as the prominent place for Christian history, because it is told that Prince Volodymyr, already one of these famous Slavonic princes that brought up Kyiv Rus, that he was baptized actually here in Chersones. So this is considered to be the lullaby of Christianity, and this is where Christianity came to the big land, the mainland of Ukraine in 10th century. Many of these Greek ruins are endangered because the occupying power, the Russian occupying power, are excavating illegally the archaeological sites and taking the archaeological objects outside of Crimea, outside of Ukraine, basically stealing them. These are also announced and reported as part of the war crimes, and culture crimes, because this is part of Ukraine's history, Ukraine's legacy that is being stolen. Moving further in history, we find ourselves in medieval times. And in 10th, 11th century, in the central part of what is now Ukraine, the city of Kyiv was found. It was created basically on the very comfortable situation, on the very comfortable landscape, on the hills that were surrounded, were washed by the river of Dnipro, and creating a very safe place, which could be at the same time easily secured from the enemies, and could have a very tight trade connection through river, and it was situated in the middle, in between the different trade routes. So according to the legend, the city was founded by these legendary three brothers and a sister, but the historians that already proved that this is just a legend and does not have any kind of historical background behind it. But we still consider that the city of Kyiv is named after the oldest brother, Kyi, who was actually the founding father of the city. We actually don't even know the real date when the city was created, and the date that is used now is actually just a Soviet fiction, Soviet historical fiction, as there are many historical Soviet fictions about Ukraine's culture and history, at least. But we definitely know that the city already existed in 10th century, because there is a letter of 10th century about a person who lived in Kyiv, and this letter you can find on the left. And the city was created basically as the center of slave trade by the northern occupiers, we can say, also the representative of the Scandinavian tribes that basically occupied the village then and created a city out of it. So basically, Kyiv was a mixture of Scandinavian and Slavic culture. So the Slavic tribes lived there, but the noble Scandinavian princes created a city and developed it into a huge, actually, medieval city that was of great importance of its time. And the greatest, we can say, the most famous prince of the medieval Kyiv Rus, which it was called later, was Volodymyr. He was famous, let's say, and most famous for two things. First of all, because he was the one to unite different Slavic tribes that occupied the territory of Ukraine, Belarus, what is now Ukraine, Belarus, but he also brought Christianity to these pagan tribes, that was the let's say historical decision that changed the history of the whole continent, the whole region. This is you can see a famous painting from one of the cathedrals in Kyiv depicting the baptizing of Saint Volodymyr, what he became, but what he's known as Volodymyr the Great. After Volodymyr the Great brought Christianity and united all these tribes, Kyiv Rus started to develop very quickly. It became hugely important state of its time. And the grandsons of Saint Volodymyr, Yaroslav the Wise, as he was called, decided that he needs to build a powerful cathedral as beautiful as the cathedral of St. Sophia that he has seen in Constantinople. And he built St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv that not only becomes the largest Christian city in Kyiv Rus, but is also a library, a huge library, and a school, and education center and scientific center. So St. Sophia Cathedral, with its beautiful ornament and mosaics that you can see on the right, Oranta, the Savior, it's the famous mosaics of 11th century that is also well preserved, and it's been restored, of course. But actually, the original building belongs to 11th century, so it was never totally ruined, although it was at some point quite abandoned, and is an example of this ancient medieval culture, along with several other objects. And aside of the famous mosaics and images, we can also find a huge number of graffiti on the walls of St. Sophia Cathedral. And these signs, oftentimes, they say about names or dates or certain agreements. And we can say that these were, let's say, the possibility of its time to note some important things in the life of people at the time when there was no newspapers, no media. They didn't have any other way to kind of record, put on record some important things. So they used the walls of cathedrals instead, putting these important notions on these walls. Today, we have the whole, let's say, study on those graffiti on the walls of St. Sophia, and there are volumes published about these graffiti. These graffiti are in dozens of different languages, both ancient and modern, and they tell you all kinds of different stories. So it's a huge study actually about the graffiti only. So the medieval country of Kyiv and Rus was not only self-centered and was there in this region. The connections that Kyiv Rus had was far beyond the, let's say, Eastern European part, and reached as far as France, for example. And Anna Yaroslavna, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, who built the St. Sophia Cathedral, was the Queen of France. She actually married the King of France and went to Paris and lived there with him. And she actually wrote letters to her homeland saying that it is so let's say, undeveloped where she lives compared to her homeland, compared to Kyiv. So we can say that, the level of culture and development in Kyiv, in medieval Kyiv, was probably more sophisticated than in Paris of 11th century. Another masterpiece, another prominent architectural and cultural site we have left from that ancient times is the St. Cyrillic Church. And on the right, you can see a marvelous image of the angel folding the sky, a beautiful mythical image of this sacred figure who actually, folds the sky as a piece of paper, giving us numerous ideas and images to think, to imagine about the worldview and about the imagination of our predecessors 1,000 years ago. Fortunately, this church also survived throughout 1,000 years, and has remained basically in a very well-preserved state, situated in Kyiv, also, as well as St. Sophia Cathedral. In 13th century, Kyiv Rus was invaded by the Golden Horde, and it was very cruel invasion, basically erasing most of Kyiv Rus, most of medieval cities from the surface of Earth. And basically, this invasion stopped the existence of Kyiv Rus and made another chapter of history appear. And one of these important branches of this history is the western part of Ukraine, that actually it was also western part of Kyiv Rus, that united in this Halych-Volyn princehood. So these were basically two regions that united as one princehood, as one state. And they had a very famous king, King Danilo, who actually brought up this state, this princehood, to a very mature and developed state. And it a few objects, a few things we have from that time is basically this crown. On the left, you see the original crown which was made after the crown of King Danilo in 16th century, probably from the same materials. And this original crown, unfortunately, disappeared in the middle of 20th century in Poland, at that time occupied by the Soviets. So we don't know the place where it's kept or where it is, or if it was destroyed. So we don't know much about it. And on the right, you can see the reconstruction based on the original crown of a later time of 20th century. And also from that period of Halych-Volhyne princehood, we have a chain of castles that surrounded this princehood, that surrounded this kingdom. One of them, Olesko Castle, you see, is just outside Lviv, the city which is basically the capital of Western Ukraine, which hosted now the largest number of internal migration in Ukraine. And this Olesko Castle, together with the number of others, was a very important system of fortresses, keeping the kingdom safe and protecting it from the invasions and during these wars that happened a lot in that time. Also, a large part of Ukraine of that time became part of Rzeczpospolita, or Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom. And most of Ukrainians at the time were enslaved basically by noble Poles, noble Lithuanians, noble Austrians. Yeah, so it was also Austro-Hungarian Empire at one side. And at some moment in 15th century, huge numbers of these enslaved Ukrainians started to run away to the free lands of steppe in the central part of Ukraine. And when when the number of these runaway people was large enough, they created a proto-state, which was a military kind of state, which they called Zaporizhska Sich. Zaporizhia is the name of the city which exists, which is named after this state we had. And these people started calling themselves Cossacks. Cossacks meaning free person. So the Cossack state of Zaporizhia was basically this pro-Ukrainian construction, let's say. It was a military male state, which only allowed male, which was living out of military assignments. They were fighting for different powers and making money of it. And they also developed their own state on a large part of Ukraine's central southern part. On this famous painting by Ilya Repin, who was himself a descent of Cossacks, noble family, he depicts this famous moment when the Cossacks are writing a response to the Turk Sultan, and you can see this happy, smiling, brave Cossacks, that are not afraid, to start a fight with the largest Turkish army of its time. Also reminds us of something we're going through. So Cossacks were not only about military and army and fighting. They were also people of culture and education. And thanks to the Cossacks elite, Cossacks noble people, we have a phenomenon culture which is known as Cossacks Baroque. They supported and funded building churches, building monasteries. And those monasteries were also centers for education, for culture, for artistic practices. And on the right, you can see one of the examples of the icon of this period of the 17th century. It's quite late already, 17th, 18th century, which reminds us of these Baroque shapes, which we know from West European culture, but with the very specific sound, with very specific imagery that was only recognized in this in Ukrainian, in Cossacks Baroque style or imagery. You see these images of these female saints who are at the same time warriors, because if you look carefully behind their crosses, you can see sables, yeah, so these are guns they are holding in their hands, and are quite confident in, you know, in their faces, in their gesture, and well dressed, and depicted as these queens having crowns on their heads. As well as this Baroque architecture is a fancy with a lot of decor and design, having many elements, expensive and quite difficult to build. And fortunately, we have a lot of these examples of the Cossacks Baroque architecture left throughout different regions of Ukraine nowadays, and also the imagery. And what is interesting about the Cossacks period is that we are on the side of only sacred culture, we begin to receive this example of non-sacred culture, which depicts regular people. Well, how regular? They were noble, of course. They were wealthy enough to allow to have their portraits depicted, created, yeah. So this was something that they had to pay for, and of course they needed to have a pretty house, a mansion to put it in. But this is also one of this phenomenon of Cossacks Baroque's time, is actually having the first examples of non-sacred imagery and portraits. You can see one of these examples, Persona portrait of a family. So you can even imagine that, you know, we can speak about the role of women, a role of female figures in that culture, because they were portrayed alongside with men on the same portrait together, and you can see quite equally depicted, you know, so have been these equal figures in Ukrainian culture. But probably the most prominent, the most famous image of Cossacks' time is Cossack Mamai. Cossack Mamai is basically a legendary, a myth figure, but it is also kind of a universal symbol for numerous Cossacks who were injured in their during their campaigns, who had probably wounded their hands or legs, or they lost their sight and they were not able to fight anymore. And what they did, they took a kind of a string instrument. You can see different kinds depicted. It could be domra, it could be a kind of a proto-guitar, a guitar, or other type of string instrument. And they would travel on a horse around the country, and they would sing songs about the history of brave people, of Cossacks, of Zaporizhzhia siege. And then these images of these legendary Cossack became so famous that every Ukrainian house used to have an image, basically a photograph, a symbol of this person who was at the same Cossack, at the same time a Cossack, at the same time a poet, actually. Yeah, they were first Ukrainian poets who were using the simple oral language, not the one that the books were written in, because books were written in ancient Greek, ancient in Latin, or ancient Slavic language that people actually didn't use when they were speaking, while these Cossacks Mamai, they were using the oral language, the language that people spoke and understand, and put them in rhyme and make a story, a narrative about Ukraine's history and nowadays. So they were kind of a journalist, but also at the same time poets of the time. They brought the news, but they brought it in a very poetic and beautiful manner. And you can see hundreds of these images around Ukraine in different areas. And of course, in every Ukrainian museum, you can find imagery of Cossack Mamai in all different kinds. After the the Moscow princehood started invading east of Moscow and occupied large part of Ukraine. And Ukraine basically started to be divided between the two empires, the Moscow state, or the as it later became Russia, Russian Empire. And on the other side, it was Poland and Austro-Hungary. So Ukraine lost its statehood and its independency for quite a long time, for several centuries. And Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language were forbidden. So people could not speak, people could not study in Ukrainian. They they were not even allowed to speak it. And so culture became also a form of protest, a form of struggle for sovereignty, struggle for statehood. And this is why it was a kind of a heroic state by Ivan Kotlяревsky, who was a poet. Well, he was basically public servant. Yeah, he worked for some bureaucratic institution, but at the same time he was writing something, and he decided to write a poem on the topic of ancient Greek poetry. It was Aeneid by Homer, and he created this poem in Ukrainian, in oral, in spoken Ukrainian. And he also travested these ancient Greek heroes and ancient Greek gods in Ukrainian Cossack suits, and they were speaking, about their Ukrainian Cossacks issues. So he created a prominent, brilliant, amazing piece of literature, which was at the same time a symbol of Ukraine's wish for statehood, for independence. And this hero, Cossack Aeneid, was a kind of this, many of these Cossacks who were leading the army of Cossacks in their fight for statehood. So this book, which appeared in almost in the middle of 18th century, was a real heroic act and a very important book that influenced all the history, all future literature and culture, but also was referred to as one of the steps in fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine's culture is very deeply connected with literature, and we even call that ourselves a literature-centered culture, because actually literature is a center of our essence, of our culture, and is a center for our statehood struggle. And one of the fathers, maybe the most important father of Ukraine's idea or Ukraine's statehood, is Taras Shevchenko, definitely. His Kobzar is a kind of a Bible for every Ukrainian, and the story behind his life is also compared, can be compared to Ukrainian story. He was born as basically as a slave, as a kripak, which was the name of a peasant who didn't have a passport, who didn't have any rights. He could only pay, he could only work for his master just to get some food. So he was this just poor boy who had a big talent in art, and he was a talented artist, first of all. And he was brought together with his owner, together with his master, to St. Petersburg, where he could meet artists of famous artists, prominent artists, who actually came together and created like a fundraising campaign to buy him out of this slavery. So they bought him, and he became a free person, and he became a very famous artist. And he started to write, and he started to write again in Ukrainian about the Cossacks' time, about the past of Ukraine. And he was, in his poetry, he was bringing a lot of these ideas about the future free Ukraine that is broken the occupation of the empire, the Russian Empire, and is having, you know, a bright future as a free country. So these ideas that he brought in his poetry became really revolutionary. And this was already middle of 19th century. At the same time, when in the West, in all the Western and Central Europe, we have the Spring of Nations, and this idea of different cultures, different peoples having their own states was very much, you know, spread around this part of the world. And definitely Shevchenko was the figure who picked this up and who could write about it and who could find the proper form to communicate it to his people. So he became immediately, you know, in his lifetime, a hero, a worshipped basically figure, like Mickiewicz for Polish people, like many other poets in their countries back in 19th century. But, you know, Ukrainian history of culture is not about only male history. Luckily, we also had very prominent female artists in Ukraine's culture, and Lesa Ukrainka was definitely amongst the most bright among them. She was born and raised in Ukraine, and she was fascinated by these mythology, by these legends and folk culture of 19th century in the western part of Ukraine, where she lived most of her life and where the family came from. And so she wrote different kind of poems and poetry. And her most prominent and her most famous probably poem is the Song of Forest, which tells you a story of this mythological figure of Mavka, who basically is like an elf in the woods, and she meets this human guy, this human boy, and they fall in love. But this is, you know, an impossible love between the two worlds, and so they cannot be happy together, and the poem actually ends tragically. I think we all will have an opportunity to find out more about this story behind Lesa Ukrainska's poetry, because Ukrainian production company is working on the cartoon. It's going to be a full length cartoon, an hour and something, produced together with international production companies, and it will have international release in December this year, so in just a few months. And I'm pretty sure that it will also be in the UK and all the Western Europe, and America, and of course. So I'm pretty sure we'll be able to see how, you know, the contemporary interpretation of that story that Lesa Ukrainka left to us. Lesa Ukrainka was also a feminist. She had many of these feminist ideas in her writings, and she was also the first person in the international in the world history who wrote the Stone Master from the eyes of a woman. So she kind of interpreted this famous story, but from the eyes of a woman in this script. And we're slowly now in the 20th century. So we are in the beginning of 20th century, when in 1917 in Kyiv, we have, during the collapse of the Russian Empire, we have a revolution for Ukraine's independence. And in 1917, after a struggle and after a big battle for this independence, Ukrainian National Republic is announced, and it is even recognized by several states. So the statehood is finally there, it's achieved. And one of the first things that this new state is deciding to do is to open the Art Academy of Ukraine. And before that, before 1917, Ukraine didn't have any kind of artistic academy or artistic institute, because in order to create a school or academy in the empire, the local government had to get a permission from the state, so from the capital. So Kyiv many times asked for permission to open an art academy in Kyiv, but it was not allowed. So it was something that empire also didn't want Ukraine to have. It didn't want to develop its own artistic culture, and it also forced Ukrainian talents to go to capital in order to get education and in order to have a career and become an artist, actually, and work as an artist. So this was a really revolutionary achievement when they finally were able to open Art Academy of Ukraine in 1917. And on this photograph, you can see the founding fathers of this academy, all famous artists by themselves, of different styles, of different principles. And you can see what these artists were actually doing at the time. So these were artists who actually produced the national symbols. So the national trident and the money, they were designed by prominent artists of its time. And professors of Art Academy. The Art Academy of Ukraine, founded in 1917, actually is still there. So we now have this National Academy of Arts and Architecture, which is a kind of transformed and reformed Art Academy of Ukraine that was found more than 100 years ago. So among the professors and students and prominent artists of its time, I would like to call a few names and show you some examples of their work, unfortunately without any further comment because we are just short of time. But I just wanted you to know that there are such artists as, for example, Vsevolod Maximovich, who was a symbolist artist, and you can see this figure of a lonely man on the black and white background. Maximovich didn't live long. He killed himself, unfortunately, and he didn't even live until 30, but he created a number of prominent artworks that you can see in Ukrainian museums now, basically. Unfortunately, he was not known beyond the borders of Ukraine, is just because he didn't have, the time for that. Krychevsky, they were actually two brothers. One was a prominent architect, another an artist, and he was also secession artists with a lot of folklore, a lot of these traditional elements in his over. Some people even compare him with Klimt, especially this work you can see here, like a kiss of Klimt is a kind of the same narrative. Alexander Murashko was working with impressionistic ideas and impressionistic approaches, and some of his most prominent works, we don't even know their location now, because they were bought immediately after he was creating them, and they were taken away to some private collections, and we can't even trace them. But some works are still in Ukraine accessible, and they are true masterpieces of Impressionism in Ukraine. Another important movement and important figure we had was Mikhailo Boychuk, who was also of a peasantry origin, and he went to study in Western Ukraine. He studied in Munich, he studied in Paris, and he, in Paris, he decided that he wanted to create a Ukrainian national art style in art. And he combined the elements of the Byzantine art of medieval art, yeah, and of different elements of folk culture. And he created this monumental monumental art that in school, and he raised a number of students that were working in this style. The style is known as Boychukism, and it was developed in the 20s, in 1920s, and unfortunately it had a very tragic destiny, because in 1930s, together with the awful political repression, Boychukism was accused of nationalism, of Ukrainian nationalism, and all of its representatives, the whole group of artists, were physically exterminated. They were all killed. All their legacy was destroyed. Only few artworks survived due to lucky situations, but most of the oeuvre is just destroyed. And he was this phenomenon, these names were even taken out of art history, and only decades later art historians were able to bring this history out of shadow again. This the similar history also happened with the avant-garde in Ukraine, and to name just a few representatives, I picked these two famous artists. All of you probably know Kazimir Malevich, Alexandra Hippenko, who were either born and brought up in Ukraine. And, you know, I've never seen these two artworks together before, but when I was preparing for this lecture, I somehow decided, you know, to use these two, and I see how many similarities they have. You know, they somehow accidentally rhyme, because there is the same number of figures, and, you know, the same kind of rhyme between two white and one color figure, and this blue and yellow blue and yellow colors on the background. And I found so many things. And actually Kazimir Malevich and Alexandra Hippenko, they were friends, and they cooperated in Ukraine and did some projects together, and worked on the on exhibitions and educational projects, etc. And but were appropriated later by Russian culture, and are known mostly in the world as Russian artists, while a good half of their life and their practice was connected to Ukraine and had Ukrainian roots and origins. And if you read the autobiography of Malevich, for example, he refers to his Ukrainian roots and his Ukrainian influence as the most meaningful and crucial in his life and creativity. Another prominent figure in Ukrainian avant-garde, which is even less known, is Alexander Bohomazov, who is now called one of the three most important futurists of its time. Bohomazov not only worked as a practical artist, yes, as actually a painter, but he also developed his own theory of art. He wrote it in 1914, and only because he was lacking money to publish. So we cannot speak fully about avant-garde in Ukraine without mentioning the sculpture and Alexandra Hippenko, who was the first sculptor who used the ideas of cubism in three-dimensional art and sculpture. He also had some inventions, because he was also a kind of an engineer, and he invented some things, but I just wanted to show you how he used these cubistic ideas, and the colors that were super important and crucial in art in Ukraine, not only avant-garde but art in general. And also Archipenko was the first to use emptiness as the creative principle. So on the right you can see one of examples of his sculptures, where actually the hole in the middle is also kind of an imagery approach. Yeah, so it's a method he used using these holes. there was also a very important figure and phenomena in theater. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide at the moment, but I just wanted to tell about it quickly. Les Kurbas, a famous director, Ukrainian director, who created his own theater system, and his theater named Berezil, which actually would be celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, but unfortunately we don't have the situation where we can celebrate anything cultural at the moment. So Les Kurbas was also this avant-garde experience, practiced this avant-garde approach in theater and was very successful. And his life was also very unfortunate because he was also killed by a bullet in 1930s during the Red Terror. So in cinema, we had also a lot of experiments and avant-garde influence, and just to name a few names, Dziga Vertov and Alexandra Dovzhenko, who created the films that are part of the 100 most famous films ever. So Dovzhenko's The Earth, Zemlya, and Vertov's Man with a Man with a Camera are the masterpieces of international film, and I would highly recommend you to watch it because it's a real pleasure and a discovery. And so I just mentioned several times that there were artists who actually created something very interesting, important, that experimented with the means and the topics, and they were eventually killed by the Bolsheviks, by the Russians. And this actually was the whole generation of artists, writers, directors, all kinds of artistic creators who were executed. And this period in Ukraine, which started in early 20s and ended in mid-30s, is known in our histories as executed Renaissance. Because during these, well, roughly 15 years, the whole generation of artists, hundreds of people started working consciously as Ukrainian artists in newly created Ukrainian Republic. But as you know, as the Soviet regime established itself and didn't need any more loyalty or support from the people, and only became a terroristic, a very brutal regime, they decided to exterminate the whole generation of artists who were actually proclaiming Ukraine's European approach, Ukraine's European principles and values. So in order to solve this national question, as they put it, they decided to just kill those people who could bring those ideas. And literally hundreds of people were sent to different labor camps, and they were executed in several days, sometimes 2 people with 1 bullet, because for Bolsheviks, bullets were more valuable than people. So they would save bullets in killing 2 people with 1. I just show you some examples of the paintings, and unfortunately don't have time to go into details and to name the authors. So I'm also trying to give you examples of contemporary Ukrainian culture that has to do with our heritage, with our history, so you can kind of, prolong this discovery and this exploration yourself. This film, you can see the poster on the right, is about this executed Renaissance. It's the recent film by Taras Tomenko. It has just been released, and its premiere in the UK happened 2 weeks ago in London. I hope it will be around in cinemas and festivals. So if you just by chance see it, please don't miss it. Slovo House was a house in Kharkiv, basically built by the writers. Slovo means a word, so a word as an instrument for writers. And so these artists, these writers, they inhabited this house in the center of Kharkiv. And at some point, they were all arrested, and most of them were killed or sent out to labor camps for decades and could never return to their home again. On the edge between the 20th and 21st century, we had, on the 19th and 20th century, we had also a number of prominent artists that were deeply connected with the folklore practices, with the folk art. And Maria Primachenko is definitely the most important figure to speak about it. This peasant woman who had no education at all, who didn't have any knowledge about international art, about modernism, about history of art or other kind of arts, created an amazing, fantastic world of creatures and places. And she gave them the most wonderful poetic names. Sometimes she would actually create a small rhyme, a poetry about it. And she created this beautiful work that amazes the generations ahead. And maybe some of you visited the Venice Biennale this year, and you know that the work by Maria Primachenko is actually opening a biennial, the major, the most, the central, the curatorial project of the biennial this year. And maybe also some of you heard on the newsfeed in March that the museum of Maria Primachenko was burned down by Russians. When Russians occupied Kyiv region, the north of Kyiv region, in February and March, the museum in the city of Ivangkiv, where actually the artist lived, and a large of her collection was kept, more than 25 artworks. The museum was bombed and it was burned down to ashes. And until the whole area was liberated, we didn't know about the destiny of the artworks. But after it was liberated, we found out that luckily the security guard of this museum, together with his wife, actually entered the burning museum, and they took out the artworks and they saved them. So that was a real, heroic act of these simple people who realized how important these artworks were for Ukraine's culture, and they were able to save it. In mid-20th century, during the most difficult periods of the Soviet regime, of the Soviet times, unfortunately, Ukrainian artists could not perform freely. They could not work freely because they were so badly censored. And one of the few topics that they were able to work with was folklore. So some of these artists would use, for example, the ideas and the images from Maria Primachenko works. So you saw them in the previous image, and now you can see that this is a mosaic in a central palace for youth and kids and youth in Kyiv, is designed in a manner to kind of refer to Maria Primachenko artworks. So many of the artists in the 60s and 70s, they would work with these, let's say, decorative type of art, which was mosaics. For example, Alla Horska, a female artist, again, female artists have a big importance in Ukraine's history. She created a number of mosaics in the eastern cities of Ukraine. And for example, this marvelous piece in Mariupol, in the south of Ukraine. And just a few days ago, we had photographs appeared in the internet showing that these mosaics was totally destroyed by Russians. So it doesn't exist anymore. So you can only see it on the photograph, and that's it. It doesn't exist anymore, and we don't even have the possibility to come to Mariupol and save the remains of this mosaic to restore it later. So it's possibly it will be gone forever. So Alla Horska, who was also part of this dissident movement and who was very active in human rights movement in Ukraine, she was killed by the KGB when she was still very young in her own yard. Another super famous and important artwork that I want to tell you about from the 60s and 70s that symbolizes actually the state of art in Ukraine is the Wall of Memory by two artists, Ada Rybachuk and Volodymyr Melnichenko. This was the central artwork of their life. This was a monumental piece at the cemetery, at the central cemetery in Ukraine. They created the story of birth and death and life, birth, life, and death, which was a few hundred meters long. They spent 7 years of their life just creating this piece. Or they spent several years on research and creating the sketches, and then 7 years to build it actually out of concrete. And they were about to paint it when the censorship committee came, and they said that they don't allow it because it's too formalistic. And the result of 7 years of work of these two artists was literally destroyed in just a few days. It was all covered with a thick layer of concrete in front of their eyes. Luckily, they were not arrested, but actually they could have been. Speaking about the movement, artistic movement in 60s, we have to remember that the 60s was a time of thaw, and it was another attempt of these ideas of Ukraine's independence grow and speak out. And it's interesting that in this Ukrainian struggle for sovereignty, we have non-Ukrainians, I mean, non-ethnic Ukrainians who were quite important figures. And Parajanov, Serhiy Parajanov was one of them. He was of he was not of Ukrainian origin. He came and he became one of the most prominent. So this very famous piece, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, screened by Parajanov, based on the Ukrainian novel of a famous Ukrainian writer of 19th century, tells you a story that is happening in the Western Ukraine, and it's one of the masterpieces also of the world cinema, which I highly recommend you to watch. So the moment of the premiere of this film was also one of the biggest stand up for Ukraine's dissidents, and this the moment when they announced actually that Ukraine, the independent Ukraine, has to be. Ukraine is a diverse country. It's a sovereign country of political nation of people from different backgrounds that call themselves Ukrainians by choice, not by birth or whatever, or force. And we are based, and our foundation is in European values of freedom, of human rights, of dignity and freedom. And this is also part of our cultural heritage, from the Cossacks' time, and these free people of steppe. And we are struggling in this brutal war for our right to be, for our right to speak our language, for our right to know the true history we had, and to create our own culture that we want to live in, and we want to celebrate. So I thank you so much for your time, for your attention. Sorry for these technical inconveniences. I hope you will just begin opening and exploring Ukrainian culture inspired by this lecture in the future. And I'm very happy. If you have any questions, would be very happy to answer them.